Okay, so welcome you all the webinar and the key findings from a US DOE project on floating solar PV research project. My name is Manjunath Matam. I'm the co-PI in this project. Colin Kettles is the PI. She's on the call as well. And yes, so the agenda for today's presentation. Okay, let's go with some housekeeping items before we get into the actual details. Then some background about the PV systems and also getting into the project background. Then the project details, what the project goals were, and what we studied, what we collected, and finally what we found in the site. We'll get into the details. Okay, the housekeeping items. Yes, we are recording this webinar and it will be available on the YouTube as well. Yeah, please post your questions and comments, whatever in the chat. We'll take them as the time permits. These are the email IDs. Please, you can contact us again later also at the later site. And I'm giving here the link for the website. This is like a one-stop for all. If you want to know about this project or the data we collected from this project, we are going to make it public, and also the outcomes of this project. For all, yes, this is a one-stop. Okay, so about today's webinar participants. Yes, I see like a 44 have registered for this webinar, and in terms of the solar PV knowledge, and I see around 90% of them are actually from intermediate and above, and there are 11% of the beginners as well. In terms of the profession, I do see around 40% of the business side and around close to the 50% of the researchers, and the rest are students and the public as well, participation. So I have tailored this presentation from the intermediate level and from the business and research point of view. Okay, so some background, some basics about the PV. So PV module is actually what you can purchase from the market. You can install it. And if you look at inside the PV module, you look at the small cells. These cells that actually connected internally behind the glass in series. And usually on the back side of the module, you see a white blank sheet. And in some cases, the latest technology, also they put a glass. It's called glass to glass or bifacial. And these PV modules, they are, if you a group of them, they are called PV array, and they are connected to the inverter. And from inverter, it actually goes to the grid. So this is the simplest representation. This you can see on a rooftop, on the top of your house, or even in the bigger PV field, in the megawatts PV field. The scale is different. It maximizes. And there are some additional parts to it. Okay, so a little more background. They're looking at the pictures on the left side, the land PV systems, which are installed on the land. And on the right side is actually the floating PV systems. So it's the pics are actually from a 2 megawatt PV field. And what the difference we see? Yes, the iron racking structure and the land PV field, and there is a floating structure on the floating PV. And in terms of the life, the two PV systems, they could last from 20 to 25 years. That is the expected life. In terms of the cost, yes, FPVs could cost some 15 to 20% more. And okay, so what about the biggest loss causing factors? On the land PV systems, it is actually the soiling. So in the sense, because they sit actually idle in the field, on the PV panels, dust accumulates over time. And sometimes it does wash off because of rains, but it accumulates. That is one of the biggest loss causing factors, the PV systems. And another important aspect need to be considered is the limited life of the inverters. That is the one sticking point in the PV systems. Okay, usually they have a 5 years. Now they are even going for the 10 years warranty by the manufacturers, inverter manufacturers. Those are the systems that needs replacement over time. And in the design, the one is the biggest, the factor The differentiates the land PV and the floating PV is the spacing. You can see here in the bottom two pictures, the spacing between the rows of the PV structures. So it's called, usually we call it as a GCR ratio, the ground coverage ratio. It's higher for the land PV systems, and it's small for the floating PV systems, as of course, as the structure limits the spacing in the floating PV structure. Okay, so we talked about the land PV systems, what is the loss causing factor, and what about the FPVs, the floating PVs? So what is the loss causing factor for them? Or one of the theoretical assumption we have as of today, even in the literature, is does actually keeping the modules on top of the water keep them cooler? And does it lead to the more power production? And another important question is, okay, how actually this floating PV structure impacts the ecology or the water underneath, the life underneath the PV panels? Is there an impact to it? And how does it impact? Okay, so this is with this background, and this is the project, the quantifying and evaluating the fundamental characteristics and benefits of floating PV systems. So it's a CETO US Department of Energy sponsored project. It's a 1.1 million project, and with a 20% cost share from us, the partners. The period of performance of this project actually was from 2020 to 23. And because of the challenges initially and the COVID, it actually got delayed. Now the project ends by the end of this month, 2024. What the goal? Yes, study the ecological impacts. That is one of the important goals. And the second most important is collecting the data, analyzing the FPV's performance, the temperature over the time, and make this data available to the public so that in the future, the more research models can be developed based on this data set. And on this project, the FSEC, the UCF is lead, and the partners are UC Davis and the NREL and OUC. Okay, so getting into the few more details of the project. So we actually studied 4 sites, PV sites. 2 of them are located in Florida, and the two are in California. So the left Altamont Springs, 960 kilowatt, it's a stormwater pond. And then the OUC Orlando, it's a 32 kilowatt small one. It's a stormwater pond again. The Windsor, California, it's actually 1.78 megawatt. It's actually bigger PV plant. And the last one, our favorite site, it's actually the Farniente. It's in California. As I said, one of the goals of this project, comparing the floating PV performance and its benefit compared with the land PV. As you can see here on the picture on the right side, the Farniente is the only site which has the floating PV and the land PV sitting next to each other. And of course, they actually differ in terms of the PV capacity. And it's a irrigation pond. And the PV panels and the floating actually cover pretty much all, more than 90%. And all the 4 sites, the common features, yes, all of them are facing south. And also we actually tied each PV system, floating PV system, to the land PV system for the comparison. For other 3 sites, except the Farniente, the comparable land PV system, they were actually not situated close to it. Some of them are actually some miles. In one case, it's actually 50 miles. So it actually impacts the results as well. Okay, so we have been collecting the data for the past 20 months. Because the project is actually 3 years, it takes time even getting onto the site, getting access to the system, and installing our data logger temperature sensors. So we actually collected 2 kinds of the data from the sites. The one is the time series data. So which means for each site, we actually went with our setup, the data logger, and we actually attached thermal RTD sensors, resistance, temperature, detector sensors, and back of the PV modules. And we actually set up the data logger on the floating structure as well for all the 4 sites. Okay, so for PV site, floating site, we actually selected 5 PV modules, as you can see here, which are marked in the red color, the red dots. For all the sites, they are actually located on the extreme corners, northeast, northwest, southwest, southeast, and in the center. It is possible for the 3 sites. For the bigger one, it's not possible because of the limitations, the length of the wire. It can go the sensor length from the data logger. It actually limited us going to the extreme corner. And apart from this, you can also see for the land, we actually have 3 thermocouples, RTDs connected to the PV modules. And for each PV module, we actually attached on the backside of the module 3 sensors. It's not just 1, 3 sensors. So because the each PV module has 3 subsections, the idea was to cover one subsection or one sub array of each PV module. We have been collecting 1-minute frequency data from these sites for the past 20 months. And yes, we have been collecting PV module temperatures and also the water temperature. For the water temperature, so we actually set up the underneath the PV array. As you can see here in the picture, it actually goes to the from the top of the structure, close to the structure, to the bottom of the lake of the pond. And we actually measure the water temperature in 3 levels, close to the water surface and the medium and the bottom. And other data we get actually from the site owners is the inverter data and also the weather data. And we collected that as well. Okay, so the another data we actually collected from the sites, it actually through the manual approach for doing the all water ecological studies. It mostly done by the UC Davis. Okay, so getting into the details, as I said, because the Forniente became our favorite site, and most of the results we'll be discussing here belong to that site as well. In terms of the site plan and the PV systems configuration, okay, so these are the locations of the thermocouples. We are measuring the temperature, and you can see they're actually situated in the different inverters. In terms of the numbers, this is inverter 7, this is inverter 9, this is 12. And for the land PV, all of them are located in the inverter 2. Okay, the idea has been to make a perfect apples to apples comparison because the land PV, there are existing one popular. The floating PV, it's actually upcoming. So the question is, the floating PV, does it give better performance, better power production compared to the land PV? And we just want to make the perfect apples to apples. But before we get into the actual results, it seems it's not a perfect comparison, but still we make it best out of it. And what are the differences, even in the design side as well? Okay, in terms of the configuration, the way they were set up, for the floating PV, the angle of inclination, the floating PV modules, actually 22.5 degrees. And for the land PV, it's actually 20. They're a bit flatter compared to the floating PV. And another important aspect, as I said before, is the GCR ratio, or the spacing between the rows. The land PV, it's actually 3 times more compared to the floating PV. That is one big difference, even in the design side, before we make a perfect comparison. And another important difference is the DCSC ratio. So what is this ratio means? So which means this is the PV array we connect. They have a capacity. We just multiply the power capacity of each PV module and the number of modules we have. This is what we get, 33.7 kilowatt. But actually inverter capacity is this much, 33.3, which means that is the maximum power it can actually output. But the array is bigger. Okay, that is for the floating PV. For the land PV, it's even higher. It's 1.35 with the PV array at capacity of 44.9 kilowatts, the same inverters. Okay, so how actually makes this difference? There's a higher DC ratio or the lesser DC ratio. As you can see here, I'm just giving a graphical illustration. So what happens in the morning time when there is no sunlight or it starts coming, the PV arrays or the inverters, they starts producing power from the zero. It actually starts increasing. As soon as it actually hits this 33.3 kilowatt, then the inverter starts only taking the constant power from the PV array. Though the array is capable of producing more power, it actually flattens. We call it as a clipping, the terminology. So this is the background curve is actually for the high DCAC ratio. The front, the orange one, is actually with the less DCAC ratio, which means if you have a higher size PV array, you get into the clipping earlier than the other case when you have a lesser ratio. Okay, next. Sorry, okay, so yes, those were the project details, and we getting into the actual findings of the project. So what are the challenges we had in the field? We had quite a few challenges, and yes, the site related ones, and getting out of the sites, the floating ones, because they are floating on the water, and you need a boat to float on the water. And of course, we thanks to our partners and the site owners. They were so cordial in extending to us all the support. As you can see in the first picture, the people come here with a boat so that we can actually get onto the structure. Yes, another challenge. Yes, walking on the floats is always challenging. They're not static. As you step, they actually go a little bit lower, and you have to move on. For this site, me and my colleagues, Dave Chaser and Donald Metzger, we actually visited the site, and on the shore, we actually promised. So we won't be three together on the floating. We have to be at least a couple of feet far away so that we don't sink in the water. Okay, so, and it seems it's not us, not even the visit the sites, even though some animals do, of course, and they seems to be interested in our sensors as well. And sometimes even they uh, get in the wires and damage the wires, even the sensors. And you can see in the rightmost picture, it's actually our engineering technician, Donald Metzger, is working on replacing one of the sensor, which was damaged due to some animal activity. Okay, so another challenge, the data. Yes, getting a flawless data, it's actually quite challenge. And yes, as you can see here, we are looking at on the x-axis, it's only the daytime. And on the y-axis, we have the temperature. And we are actually looking at the temperature of all the floating PV modules temperatures, and also the ambient temperature of the floating PV system. So what do we see here? As you can see, this is the result even after doing some basic filtering. We actually filtered for the peak value. As you can see here, we don't see data higher than 100. Yes, in some cases, because of some outliers, some issues in the data, we do get some higher values higher than the 100C. We just filter them out even below the 0C. And also we filter for nighttime data, which means we don't want the data collected during the nighttime. Even the data has been filtered using the sunlight data. How do we do it? This is the POA, plane of radiance, which is the sunlight. So it actually starts from 0 in the morning. It actually goes to 1000 watts per square meter during the peaks. It can even go higher. We just filter all the data which is less than 20 watts per square meter, or which is collected during the nighttime. Even after doing all this basic filtering, this is what we see. We do see some undesired spikes here, as you can see on the right side for one of the days. Yes, all of the sensors seems to be working fine, except one. Even that seems to be working fine in the noon or high radiance conditions, but especially in the morning times, we see some spikes in the data set and also in the end. end of the day. Yes, so before we do any analysis, we need to take them out. We have to filter them out. And yes, apart from the basic filtering, yes, applied one more filtering in addition to it. We just, as you can see here, the ambient data, it actually remained flawless during entire duration. And I put this physical, the limit on all the data we collected. So drop out any data, the temperature data, modules data, which is 40 degrees higher than the ambient. And we do see that all the outliers, the majority ones which are higher, have been taken out. Okay, now that is for the floating PV temperature. This is for the land PV temperature. We just applied the same techniques. Now we see mostly the flawless data here without any the spikes. Okay, so with this, the next, the challenges. Yes, even not from our own setup, we also had the challenges even from the inverters are getting like a flawless data without any interruptions. As you can see here from the Farniente site, we have 6 land PV inverters, 6 floating PV inverters. And you can see for, yes, some of the systems, they have a flawless data. It seems the inverter is working without any interruptions, but some we see huge gaps. And we are interested actually in the inverter 7, 9, and 12 because we actually have thermocouples or the sensors sitting on the PV modules connected to these inverters. So which means, yes, we collected the data. We want to make sure for those PV modules, the inverter is actually running, which means we are actually collecting the working PV module temperature. Yes, the inverter 7, it is working fine without any flaws. So which means this inverter 7 is actually the topmost, the northwest and the northeast located PV modules. So we are using those sensors. For some reasons, we don't have the inverter 9 data. So it seems in some cases inverter might be working fine, but we might be having issues in collecting the data. So we didn't consider the inverter 9 temperatures. And also inverter 12, we see some gaps here. Also, it is not considered in the analysis. Okay, so what's the findings of this project? Yes, the most important find, and everybody is interested in mostly the business because the idea was to answer whether the floating PV modules operate cooler compared to the land PV modules. The answer is yes. And from this site, after looking at the temperature data of the floating PV and the land PV, yes, we do see that floating PVs actually operate cooler compared to the land PV modules. As you can see here, we actually combining all the data into simple just one parameter for the land PV and the floating PV. On the x-axis, we have the month, and on the y-axis, we have the difference, the average land PV temperature minus average floating PV temperature. And we are just looking at how the difference is faring over the time. The positive difference in the sense, the floating PV is actually operating hotter, the land PV is operating hotter, the floating is actually operating cooler. And we see for all the months, even for all the years we collected, the value seems mostly positive. So which means the floating PV remained cooler. And this is more evident even during the starting of the year, even end of the year. The level of cooling, it's actually remained around 1 degree C. But as we get into the middle of the year, close to the summer, yes, we see the floating PV is actually operating much more cooler compared to the land PV modules. And overall, we do see that the floating PV modules, they might be operating at around 2.63 Celsius cooler or less temperature, and with a standard deviation of 3.53 Celsius compared to the land PV modules. And just one more information. So this site has their own floating structure, because actually I believe this is a very old floating site. The site owners have built their own floating structure. They didn't use any commercially available floating structures. Okay, next. Now we are looking at the same data that previously discussed, but with more parameters. Okay, on the x-axis again we have the months, and on the y-axis we have the average temperature. And what temperatures we are looking at? Parameters, yes, the floating PV, the land PV, and there is also water temperature, and the ambient temperature of floating PV and the land PV, and the mean values. This is a box plot. It actually tells us how the values during specific month, what was the range of values, and in what quantile, like so in the top 25 quantile is here, the next 25%, this is the third and the fourth 25%. As you can see for all the box plots, as we go through the months, yes, it also confirms the same thing we have seen the previous, same information again. The land PVs, as you can see the box, they are a bit higher compared to the land PV ones. Even their mean values, even, yes, the floating PV is actually lower compared to the land PV ones. And another interesting thing is looking at the water temperature. Yes, we actually collected 3 levels of water temperature. One is close to the floating structure, and one is medium, and the bottom of the lake or the pond. And average of all those three sensors, what we see is the water temperature doesn't change much, and it just follows the cycle of the year. On day-to-day basis, the water temperature might change like a 0.02 Celsius and not beyond that. And the ambient for the floating PV, land PV, and also did not change much. They remained pretty much constant. Okay, so because we said the floating one PV modules operating cooler compared to the land PV modules. Now, the next biggest question, does it lead to the more power production? Theoretically, the answer is yes. But practically for this site, we don't see that yet clearly. As you can see here, what we are seeing is same again for the monthly basis, and we are looking at the performance ratio. So what does this tells? So performance ratio 1 means we are actually producing the best output power from the each PV plant. As the ratio goes down, less power production. As you can see here, the floating PV, the inverter 7, this is cyan color. It is actually somewhere in the middle. It just changes. And for the land PV systems, they actually hit close to the 1. As I said, one of the factors that drives this performance ratio is the DC-AC ratio. The higher the ratio, you seem to hit the PR1 quickly. So we cannot make the exact comparison here. And one more parameter, we can also look at, we can tell, yes, the floating PV modules, because of this cooling, can impact the performance. Is actually looking at the PV array efficiency, which means how much sunlight is falling on the PV modules, PV array, how much we are getting out of the PV array. But the issue is we need for that the data, the DC data, the DC power, or even we can work with the AC power data. But the problem is because this DC-AC ratio, when it is more than 1, so which means we are not collecting the data in proportionate power in proportionate to the sunlight, because it actually clips the power profile. Okay, so that's one. And yes, so with that, I actually let my colleague, or maybe Bill, you want me to go ahead or you want to continue?
I'll go ahead and talk through
Please.
these.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So the Farniente site is one of the 4 sites that ManageNith and I looked at. The interesting thing, and ManageNith averaged all the data points that we had collected. Each of the panels on the FPV, we had 3 temperature sensors for each of those points. So there's roughly, was it 5 points out there, or 5 modules that we're monitoring. For the land PV, we had 1 temperature sensor per module, depending on where they were in the system. For the Orlando site, we had an OUC, a floating PV system that we monitored, again, 5 temperature points. Each point has 3 sensors. So these sensors, if you look at this left plot here, the A, the B, and there's a C in there. A is the top of the module, B is usually the bottom of the module, and C is supposed to be the center. So we're showing this plot just to show you that depending on where you look at that temperature, the land module or associated land module may be operating cooler or hotter than the floating PV temperature point. And again, as Manon just mentioned, the water temperature is pretty consistent day to day. What I did is took a look at the Orlando site and took a look at the floating module temperatures and went ahead and modeled DC power. As was already mentioned, the AC energy or power that we were gathering off the inverters was very spotty. We had quite a few data holes, and for analysis, you'd like to have a full year's worth of data to get all the seasonality in there. Also, you'd like to see the temperature data with full seasonality. One of the questions here, what was the temperature coefficient of the panels used? I don't have that offhand. I did use it for the modeling though. What I did for models is I went ahead and did a CEC 5-parameter SAM model and plugged in the temperature for the floating system, and you'll see it on the next slide, and the irradiance for either the floating PV or the land-based PV. For this analysis here, Cocoa is 60 miles away from Orlando, where the floating PV system is. So I did use the localized irradiance and module temperatures. Thanks for changing over. On the left-hand side, I thought it'd be interesting just to look at the histograms for the temperature sensors, and this kind of indicates how wide a spread or how different those temperature sensors on the floating PV really are. On the bottom plot down there, this is a yearly plot, but if you did it over the month, it would look almost identical. Those peaks show kind of the densities, or where you see the maximum module temperatures deviating from ambient temperature. And depending on where you measure that in the floating PV system, it varies a lot. And then I went ahead and plotted up the RTC, which is the Cocoa land-based system, the average and the deviation from ambient over here on the right-hand side of the plot, just to show you what it kind of looks like from a histogram standpoint. These plots were all filtered for an irradiance above 800 watts per meter squared, because I wanted to see what the peak power or peak sunlight hours look like for temperature, and see if our actual sensors kind of converge to some degree, and they didn't. Go to the next slide, please. So this is kind of the results of the modeling. So the 2 sites, as Manoj and already mentioned, are 60 miles apart. It's not an idealistic comparison. They're at different tilts. The azimuth is slightly different too. They're mostly facing south. I know the RTC site for land is definitely facing south. The OUC is basically facing south. The modules themselves are different. So someone mentioned, is the temperature coefficient different? Yes, it is. But looking at the actual model here for normalized power, and it's just averaged up in the upper right, you can see the dotted green line there. If you can see that, in the kind of warmer months, in this specific instance, the land outperformed the floating PV in every temperature measurement that we took on the OUC system. So to make a blanket statement and say floating PV always operates cooler than land isn't necessarily true. And we've seen that in some of these cases, it operates cooler. In some of the cases, it doesn't operate cooler. The lower temperatures in this specific model and this data set averaged around 3 to 4% higher land power and energy versus the floating PV during certain months. And then in other months, the floating PV outperformed. So down below the histogram, just normalized power, just giving you a number of hits, kind of where we landed for the power for floating PV. That's in the light blue. The green is the land, and then the center plot down below, that's the temperature profile for the year. Those are the, I believe those aren't averages, those are maxes for that. So the land again is running a little bit slightly cooler during the warmer months, and the floating PV is running slightly hotter. But again, this is a single point. This is not an average of all the floating modules. The other thing that we showed is that our temperature sensors, we chose 5 locations for the floating PV, the 4 corners and then the middle of the floating array. Generally speaking, we would think that the middle of the floating array would be warmer than the outside edges. And that seems to hold up to some degree. When we looked at the temperature sensors, the floating middle temperatures were warmer, and then also I think it's the lower sensor itself was warmer than the upper sensor. So the B sensor was warmer than the center or the top of the module. And then over to the right, it's just giving you an idea of how that the land and the floating mid modeled power potentially look for the OUC and the RTC land temperature sensors. And these are 1 sensor plots on the bottom. What was so there are a couple of questions here in the chat.
Okay, please.
What was the ambient differential between OUC and COCO? They were pretty close to, they fell pretty close to right on top of each other. I did plot that up quite a bit and looked at the deviation, and there wasn't, just a degree or two, it wasn't that different.
Yeah, we see here.
Yeah, right there, thank you. The depth of the pond and the average water temperature, that's another great question. And each one of these systems, the pond depth and management can probably speak to that. But we believe that the pond depth and then the actual water around the floating PV has a vast impact on how cool or hot the floating PV modules operate. And I'll let you carry the rest of it.
Yeah, thanks, Bill.
Yep.
Okay, so I think we have some questions. Maybe we can take in the end. We'll just finish it. Okay, good. Yeah, so yeah, the depth, the ponds, yes, it varied for all of them. Maybe in some cases it might be just 10 meters or 5 meters. It depends upon the site, all the 4 sites. Okay, the second important point, yes, the bird droppings. Yes, we have seen this issue. We are looking at the pics we actually got from one of our site, the 4 site. This is Windsor, California. This is during a routine visit from our engineering technician. You can see here in the picture, Donald Metzger and also the Dave Chaser. So this site has been in operation for 3 years before these pics were taken, but you can see the level of the bird droppings, especially on the north side modules and also the south side modules. So after looking at these pictures with my colleagues, I was actually making a joke out of it, because you can see here, you pick a module, you can see at least one bird dropping it on the top of the module. So you were saying, okay, looks like each PV, each bird maybe made a signature on the each PV module, but they made a big signature on the north and south modules. Okay, so this is one. The dropping seems to be more higher on the north and south modules. Okay, how does it impacted by the trees surrounding the pond? What's impact this, the bird droppings? The question is, does it impact the performance? Yes, it does. Any level of bird droppings on the PV cells, it actually impacts. As I said, the PV cell is the smallest component. If you cover one complete PV cell, So which means you are actually making the power production in that subsection of the PV array less, or if the entire PV module is less, if you're reducing the power in that PV module. If you see one entire string, suppose if these PV modules are connected in the different strings, yes, that could actually impact the string as well. Okay, so what is the impact of this find? I mean, okay, maybe we need more research whether, okay, placing a empty planks along the north and south side can actually take the bird droppings, or is this just limited to one of the sites, or this specific site? Maybe other sites they don't see this level of the bird droppings. And yes, might be because I believe right now the bird migration studies is not part of the plan, and maybe that needs to be considered just to make sure the site we are considering, we also accounted the bird droppings that is anticipated in the site. Okay, next, yes, the another important find, yes, on the floating PV modules, there seems to be high delta among the PV modules. In the sense, the temperature difference, yes, compared to the land PV modules, they are operating cooler. But how are they operating with among themselves? There seems to be higher delta. Here we are looking at some of the peaks I got visiting some of the sites. As you can see here, in the left picture, we are looking at one of the bird droppings so solidified. As you can see, they are so flat to the ground, and the rain even couldn't wash them off. You can see how it actually impacted the temperature. It's actually operating pretty harder. It's 138C, the specific location. And at another site, you can see the level of bird droppings. This is the southmost row. This is the next row. It has more bird droppings, less on the next row. But if you look at the temperature, the south one is operating at 44C, and the next row PV module is actually operating 38C. So we see almost 6 degrees difference among the PV modules. And what about the Farniente system? Yes, looking at here the results, we can see for the land PV, and for the land PV, the delta among the temperature difference among the PV modules, it remained within like a 5 Celsius and not more than that. But coming to the Farniente, the floating PV systems, yes, the beginning of the year, end of the year, they remained pretty much close, which is good. And in the middle of the year, so when they are when there is hot seasons, I mean, we see a quite difference in the temperature among the PV modules of the floating PV, almost close to like a 30C. So it's not a good sign, because we want the PV modules to operate either like a hotter or cooler at the same time. Not one is hotter, one is cooler, like we see the behavior in the beginning of the year or end of the year. And yes, so those were the 3 important finds. And other the important find, I mean, the field visit, the lesson is, okay, we see some of the modules breaking in the field due to the physical impact. This may be rare cases, but we just want to highlight that identifying and replacing them needs to be done quickly. What happens when we don't replace them? Because if you think this string just missing one PV module or its power production, the answer is no. If you think just one PV module is we are losing power, no, we might be losing more than one module equivalent power 1.29, because it's IV curves, it's characteristic IV curve, it's not flat. So which means this the bad PV module, it actually eats into the power of the good ones. So if there are 2 modules short, we might be losing power close to 3 modules. If there are 6 modules short in a string, we lose the power equivalent to 11 modules. So this is from another study, from another project. Okay, so now I will hand it to our colleagues to UC Davis.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Emma. I'm a PhD student at UC Davis, and I am responsible for the ecological branch of this project, with particular focus on avian interactions with the floating solar. So this research was conducted across various locations in California and Florida, the same 4 sites that were used for the performance research. And our work combines detailed behavioral surveys and spatial mapping facilitated by ArcGIS Survey 123 to investigate bird behavior and movement patterns in the vicinity of FPV arrays. So we conducted observational surveys over 4-day campaigns at each of those 4 FPV locations during each season, the fall, winter, spring, and summer. And each day, observations occurred for an hour in the morning or within 15 minutes of sunrise, at midday, and in the evening, or ending 15 minutes following sunset. So we collected bird location via map and observed avian species, flock size, sex, and behavior, such as flying, resting, or preening, as well as the date and the time of the observation. We tracked novel movements observed in this study area. Those were also recorded with the time of the movement and the behavior change to gain an in-depth understanding of how individuals are interacting with the surrounding environment. So the focus of the survey protocol is on species assemblage around the FPV, as well as individual bird use and associated behavior. So we categorized avian biological data, and you can go to the next slide, by trophic guilds to gain insight into specific behaviors. So our results are showing that most birds are either flying around the FPVs, which would indicate avoidance behavior, or resting near or on the array, or hunting off of the array, which indicates some novel use of the infrastructure. So the far niente system sees a greater number of seed and invertebrate eating birds, which I think is on the graph in the next slide. So those would include black phoebes or western bluebirds, while the rest of the study sites primarily host aquatic foragers like water birds. So this may be due to the surrounding geography, since far niente is right next to a vineyard, and that's a kind of habitat that would support those kinds of birds, while the rest of the study sites feature larger water body to FPV ratios and are in more urban environments, which would support more water bird species. Additionally, the panels at far niente have a slightly steeper tilt, which we think might also explain the reduced observed interactions in the site. And we also found that the Windsor site sees the most direct bird interactions with the FPV array. So these patterns are also explaining the differences in soiling at each site, which I think is on the next slide as well. And we track that by collecting some comprehensive photographic coverage of soil panel surfaces at each of the 4 study sites. We then calculated the percent cover of each panel and found that the percent cover was relatively low across all of the sites, so between 0 and 6%, with the exception of Windsor, which saw nearly double the amount of soiling on average. So far niente experiences less avian soiling in comparison to Windsor and OUC, and those are both populated by the larger waterfowl. So these results were not super surprising based on our observations. Those pictures that Manju showed earlier were pretty good indicators of that. And this confirmed our general assumption that soiling will accumulate along the perimeter of the FPV array, particularly in the front and in the back. This is an image at OUC where the blue is a cold spot, so there was less soiling overall. And then the back and the front of the array had heavier soiling. I don't have a map on this presentation, but this pattern of soiling aligns with the hotspots of avian activity that we've identified, which is also something that we were not surprised to see. So why any of this matters, we think that this work will provide insights into the ecological implications of FPVs, as well as some of the performance implications, and could contribute to the development of some mitigation strategies and design strategies, such as implementing some targeted cleaning protocols. Right now, I think Windsor is the only FPV array that has soiling sensors, and it is right in the middle where it doesn't experience as much soiling, or possibly incorporating some empty plank rows in hotspots like Manju mentioned earlier that will minimize some potential conflicts between FPV infrastructure and wildlife conservation efforts. Thanks.
Thanks, Emma. Okay, next we are coming to the The summary, yes. So the summary of this webinar, okay, what we found from the projects, yes, the floating PVs operate cooler by an average of 2.60 Celsius with a standard deviation of 3.50 Celsius. Yes, the soiling could become an issue for floating PVs. It depends upon the site specific it is. And also, as Emma just pointed, the soiling could be more on the peripheral or on the outer perimeter of the PV array. And the impact of this one, okay, maybe the future studies or before the new projects could be laid, the floating PVs, maybe considering the soiling could have the impact even in the models, so that it is well accounted in the power production. Okay, so the delta among the PV modules, yes, it is a bit higher compared to the land PV modules. Is this a design specific or the land specific? Yes, there is a possibility for that. And yes, also the studies from the UC Davis, it has, I mean, there is a publication which states, okay, floating PVs keep the water cooler even compared to the open water. Okay, this is the summary of the webinar. We have come to the end, and we just want to open for any questions in the charts. Maybe Elizabeth, any questions we have?
Absolutely. I just wanted to go back. I know Bill addressed some of these questions. However, I'd just like to revisit them to ensure they're all answered. Thomas, you had two questions. What was the temperature of the coefficient of the panels used? And what was the depth of the pond and average water temperature? Did those questions get answered for you in full?
Yes.
Excellent.
They didn't have the answer yet on the what the temperature coefficient of was the panels, because you'd have to know what the panels were, but because it's going to vary between panels. They all have a different temperature coefficient, so that would look at the energy output of the panel based on how much cooling there was in the water. So we can get that if we find out what the panels are that were used at the site.
Very true, and we did use the temperature coefficients for the models. So the CEC model that we use, the SAM model, we take the actual module model and throw that into the model. We take the irradiance, the module temperature. So what I did based on that model is I used, so we had 5 locations, 3 points per location. There's 15. The model spits out 15, modeled power points for that, right? So each temperature has its own modeled output power, but it's all based on the module that exists in that location. So for the OUC site, I use that module. For the RTC site or the COCO site, I use that module.
Okay. Could we get to what those modules were and the power output of the models? Because what we're seeing on our design is we're using different models to get the maximum, the lowest temperature coefficient, I should say. So it varies between the First Solar modules, Canadian Solar, whatever. It would be nice to get that module specs.
So we will, when we release the data, I believe it's going to be released in 2 locations. One is the UC Davis has a website that they're going to release some, if not all, the data, and then the performance data will have metadata in it. So we'll have the module types for each location. So you'll be able to look that up from there.
Great.
Excellent, thank you. And Justin, your 2 questions. What was the ambient differential between OUC and COCO? You also asked about wind. I noticed, Bill, you had mentioned about the wind sensors. So if we can maybe elaborate on that a little bit more for Justin.
Yeah, we do have a wind sensor on the MET station for each site, and Manager can kind of speak up on this, but I believe it is mounted on a land-based MET station. There is no wind sensor interior or even near the floating PV array.
And then this, I'm sorry, did somebody want to add to that?
Yeah, just real quick, we do have wind sensors at that location, so we may be able to help out at that consideration with the FPV, at least at the OUC site. Because I'd be very interested to see, I mentioned it in the chat that The depth of the pond, I think, would be a really interesting thing to look at, because I think our pond is pretty shallow, which might be contributing, as well as I think wind speed. You know, you're looking at a coastal ground mount array versus a very inland floating solar array. And so those comparables are probably, you know, have some concerns and considerations. And then I also would like to dig into the IR considerations as well later. So whenever that makes sense.
Yep. Yeah, sure. Sounds good, Ben. Yep.
Excellent. This one might be for Emma. Were the bird droppings at each site comparing FPV and same site land-based? Isn't the bird droppings related to the area? And this was from Thomas, sorry. At our Tampa site, we see less bird droppings on the FPV and minimal on both. If you'd like to elaborate on that.
Yeah, we did not do any comparisons between the land-based and the FPVs, so I can't speak to the differences there. And definitely there are differences in the soiling across the 4 different arrays that we saw. So we're working on understanding how that might happen. We have a couple of assumptions based on the tilt level, the kinds of birds that we're seeing, and some of the surrounding geography. I would be interested to see what some of the soiling looks like at the Tampa state.
Okay.
Excellent. Just moving on to just a couple more questions. Can you please let me know the IEC code for the floating solar power plant module you are using, especially the IP floating solar power plant? Can you let me know the code used in the structure?
Okay, so looks like, I mean, my understanding, because the floating PVs are pretty new, unlike the land PV ones, pretty established. I don't think the codes specifically exist yet. That's why you see the different kinds of the floatings getting into the field right now. I'm sure maybe pretty soon the specific we'll have the codes for the PV modules, the way we test them, manufacture them, yes, the inverters. But for the floating PVs, I think it is yet to make sure. Yeah, but some of the cases, even the codes, for instance, I mean, especially for design of the PV array, I think even the land ones, they follow the pretty same. But the floating structure, maybe I have to say I have to limited knowledge on that one, but I don't see any specific, especially for the floating solar PV plant.
Thank you. And I know, Justin, you had asked about this, but I'll just read out your mention here. Have some questions about the IR images. The hotspots don't seem to align. It would be good to confirm. Sorry, the chat is just blocking here with another temp sensor. IR and reflective surfaces get tricky. And then he also added pond depth would be really interesting, as I believe the OUC pond is pretty shallow, which might account for some of the lower temp differentials between them and Cocoa. I would also like to understand the wind impacts more, as the coast usually sees higher wind considerations, which would drive thermal impacts.
Yes, that's, yeah, good identify. I mean, you see, I took that picture of IR by myself with my handheld camera. So, you know, that TV module we have seen for the OUC site, it's actually on the corner. I think it must be south, west, or east, the extreme one. So, as you know, I cannot step on the structure before it. And I cannot take the picture. I have to be on the sides. You are right. They're not pretty much aligning clearly in some cases. There might be some reflection as well. That's true. Yeah. So yes,
Yeah, I just think when you look at the pictures that you showed side by side, on the right-hand image, you saw some reflection patterns as kind of like as you got further away from the close panels to you, the temperature seemed to drop over time, which wouldn't necessarily make sense from an operational standpoint. And then the impacted panel on the right-hand side with the bird droppings looked a lot hotter, whereas in the OUC image, the panel looked cooler except for the singular hotspot of the one large bird dropping consideration. So, and the beauty of white surfaces is they're omnidirectional reflection. So you can just get some really interesting kind of false positives with IR. And so confirming the sensor with like you know, any other type of temperature sensor that's not visually based would be just something valuable. I mean, it could be right, but you can kind of see on the right-hand side, you've got the one bird dropping panel that's a lot hotter, but on the OUC side, you only have the singular hot spot. The rest of the panel that has bird droppings on it seems pretty cool at that point. So again, it depends on where the kind of false positive pieces are coming.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, if you see here, okay, if you see the scale of the bar, we are looking at the IR image. It's actually stretched pretty much from 29 to 130 C and above. This part, it's actually 138 C. Does it mean the rest of the module operating the cooler? No, even it is hotter. If you see here, I think in the middle, it's actually 57 C. It's just because the hot spot is pretty hotter, the rest of the module looks cooler. I mean, just looking at the color bar.
But why would a bird dropping be 138 degrees C? It's a
Yeah.
white reflective surface. It's not impacting the module behind it. It's hyper located to the actual bird dropping. Like I have a ton of questions about that. That's not jiving with logic.
Okay. Maybe we can
So
look
it may
at
not.
that.
So let me jump in. It may not be 138 degrees C, but it could easily be 90 degrees C. So you're right. The IR images are very subjective. Having done hundreds of them, you can get some oddball results. But the fact that there is a localized hotspot there is not in dispute. The temperature
I
may
mean, could
not
that
be
not just be a
exact,
reflection?
doubtful. That is more than likely a hotspot.
Interesting. I'd be
Yes.
curious what's causing that then, because bird droppings
But
aren't inherently hot over time. So just curious about that.
you're covering up over half of that cell,
Yeah, see that on the left
so
side. You see that?
that'll turn into a hotspot very quickly.
But okay, yeah, I won't argue it. It's just
Trust me, it will.
Yes.
no, I agree. But the cell is not what's getting hot, right? Like if you look at the IR image, the cell itself is not what's radiating the heat. It's the actual bird dropping. The cell is actually larger than the bird dropping and still showing blue around the edges.
So it
We
might be
see
that
cells
something
heat up all the time, and they're pretty specific about heating up.
yeah, and it may be that the superimposed image itself is a little bit in error there, but there is a hotspot there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Bill.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Justin and Bill. And Justin, you had asked some questions. You'll see Rebecca has responded to you in the chat, giving you some great links and some more feedback. So you might just want to browse through those and get all of that detail. She has some good stuff in there for all of us on the call as well. Thomas did ask, why aren't the bird droppings cleaned off on a weekly inspection of the SFPV array? Did none of those sites have gangways to arrays?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, my understanding for the even for the land PV systems, the people, I mean, I'm talking about the bid utility scale that I'm familiar with. I don't think people employ the people just go there and clean the PV modules. I think the people might be thought the same fashion for the floating PVs. You just install them and forget forever. Yes, I mean, maybe as you pointed, maybe they need to have maybe some staff, maybe once in weekly or sometime, need some cleaning, some attention. Yeah, that could be one lesson for future.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
Emma
it's a-
just
Florida
put a
gets cleaning from Mother Nature, right? They have
Yeah,
lots of daily rain events that would make cleaning less cost effective, given that it rains so frequently there.
Yep.
I know Emma can talk more about that too.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, yeah, that's one big advantage for the land PVs because at least they're at 20 or more tilled based on the location you are in. But for the floats, irrespective of the location, pretty much they are laid flat, close to the flat. One reason is, of course, just from the protection point of view from hurricanes, so that you don't create a much space beneath underneath the PV modules, so they don't rip off if there is a wind. They're close to the flat, so when even it rains, if it is flat, there is a good advantage. Okay, once it washes off, when it is flat, okay, it washes off, maybe not completely, maybe it takes time. If it is not washed off completely, maybe that gets solidified over time.
Yeah, and Emma put a great note in there. Emma, did you want to expand on that about cleaning only once a year?
Yeah, I talked to Greg, who's in charge of the FPVs over there, and when we were talking about soiling, he mentioned that they only bring out a team about once a year to come clean, which I thought was interesting. The that's the only site that has a gangway. The rest of them are only accessible by boat.
Oh, I see.
And it's a pretty good trek from the street to the Altamont array if you are taking a boat with you. So it's really not cost effective. It's really not time efficient. So folks have not been going out there. And at least in Florida, it seems like they get enough rain events to mostly take care of the soiling that I've observed. But you know, like Windsor is still out there and doesn't get enough rain and does not see any cleaning. They do have a soiling sensor, but like I mentioned, that's in the middle of the array where they're not seeing the hot spots of soiling. So I'm not sure if they're getting the accurate information to be able to go out and send a team when they need to be cleaning.
And as Justin mentioned in the chat there, it's just not cost effective. I mean, it costs a lot of money to send somebody out there and try to clean off modules. And you'll see that in the land-based PV systems as well. You have a lot of folks out there looking at robots to clean systems and coming up with novel ways to clean off arrays. But generally speaking, the folks that sell these arrays, and there might be some on the call, they have specific maintenance schedules that they'd like people to do. And the owners look at that as a cost burden to them, and a lot of them won't do it. So.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, Billy rightly pointed. I mean, just adding my 2 cents to that. Yes, that's true. One of the utility scale site we visited, yes, it has been in operation for maybe like 10 plus years. They were pretty much, you can easily see on the bottom of the module, it's a land site. There is a soiling. And we asked the same questions. I mean, don't you clean the modules? Yes, the answer is no. I mean, it's not cost effective. And the second answer is, see, it is you clean the modules, it gives you some better, some more production. But is it like, where is the trade-off? They said, well, let it go. Maybe let the rain take it off some of it. That's fine. Because their goal was to hit the break-even period much quickly, not putting any money further. Yeah, that's one way of looking at it. Yep.
Chris had a great point. He said, last I heard from Windsor, they are meeting 100% of their production target, even with the soiling. And then Thomas had a quick question. Have you looked at the advantage of seasonal tracking and changing the panel elevation of the panels to maximize energy yield, as well as help in cleaning and snow shedding in the north?
The only system that we had planned to do an FPV study that was in a freeze location was in Colorado, and those agreements fell through. So we didn't even look at snow shedding or anything like that. The seasonal tracking, from what I understand, all of the floating PV racking and array systems are fixed tilt. They do not have the adjustability that some land systems have. So no, we did not look at any of that.
Yeah, they are fixed tilt. Yes.
Thank you, Thomas. He also added a point here with the FSPV is very easy to clean panels with a person dipping a mop in the water and cleaning. And I do, Bill, I have done a lot of research on a lot of the different devices that people are coming out with cleaning solar, which is very interesting if anybody wants to look at it. Not sure how advantageous it is. One thing I did find interesting, I just came back from a trip from Australia, where obviously I'm from, and they are actually going in the realm of vertical solar and still getting very good results. So just something I wanted to throw out there. There was a lot in the cow pastures versus land laying, where the land laying different angles was heavy with agrivoltaics as well. But Thomas said with the FSPV, it is very easy to clean, as he mentioned. We have a single axis seasonal tracking, patent pending, and are deploying at 3 DOE test sites. Great to hear.
Yeah, great to hear. Yeah, that's right. I mean, yeah, it's nice. I mean, as Thomas nicely pointed, I mean, because compared with the land, the floating, the advantage they have is because they have the water just underneath. Just take it out and mop, clean it. That's right. I mean, for the land, you need to carry, one has to carry. it's a burden, of course. Okay, I think we are coming to the end of the webinar. We are almost 10 minutes over the time. Good, at least we're on time with all. I think we answered all the questions. Any questions?
Imagine
Yeah,
if
please.
Yeah,
Please go ahead.
one last comment, and I did put it in the chat. I don't have the websites for it. I apologize, but data will be released in at least 2 platforms. One is the DOE's ODI or OEDI, so it's always forget the acronym.
It's
But
OEDI.
it's OEDI website, and the other one is UC Davis, and I believe there's a link in the chat that Rebecca put up for the UC Davis website. Hopefully we'll get the data up there and the metadata will be up there in the next couple of months. But if you have questions, please pose them to either FSEC or myself at NREL, and we can field those in the meantime.
Yeah, that's great, Bill. Yeah, answering those questions. Yep, great info.
And I would encourage everybody on the call, please follow the Florida Solar Energy Center LinkedIn, Facebook pages. This will give you an opportunity to see further incredible webinars that we can show you and bring to you on all the studies and testings that we are doing. So we do appreciate everybody attending today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.